Hey, it's Jordan. I'm joined today by Professor Richard Wolff. You are the founder of Democracy at Work, which people could find at youtube.com/democracy at WRK. WRK. I made the mistake at first, not missing zero O. And you're also obviously an economist and professor. So I want to start on the macro level because I'm seeing the stock market's up 1,000 points, then it's down 500 points, and we know the corporate media, that's their barometer of a healthy economy. But as far as I could tell, 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. The United States ranks fourth, according to Inequality for All. The U.S. ranks fourth out of 141 countries in income inequality. So this booming economy they've been talking about, I don't see it, and I travel a lot interviewing real people. Can you talk about what is actually the barometers we should be looking at a economy?
Well, you point to a very important item. It goes really to the heart of the economic system that we're in. If you do this for a living, which I do, look at the economy, try to make sense of what's going on, you very quickly learn that there are literally thousands of potential indexes or indices, ways of trying to measure what's going on. It's a little bit like being a doctor and having someone coming in saying that they don't feel well. Well, what do you now look at? Some people look at your blood, and some people look at your eyes and your ears and measure your this and that. And it turns out that any human body, and indeed any economy, is always a mixture of indices that point upward, things are getting better, and indices that point downward and everything in between. And so if you're honest, then you try to see what all the indices suggest and then make your own best judgment about the balance between the pluses and the minuses. But we don't live in a society that encourages that. We live in a society where there are enormous vested interests who, for their own well-being, decide to hype one set of indices and ignore the other. So we have the boosters. They think the economy is in great shape. Even if it's in the doldrums, they will give you 6 indices that point it's going to get better. And we likewise have folks for whom it's doom and gloom. In fact, if you want to check financial websites, you can literally organize them often according to those which tend to give you the happy rose-colored view and those that are telling you, cash in your chips, the game is over. So I try as best I can to look at all of them. And here's my result. Partly because we are such an unequal economy, as you rightly point out, and partly because the inequality has gotten so much worse over the last 30 years, we now have what a number of politicians have rightly called 2 economies in one. We have an economy for the top 1%, if you like, or maybe 5%. It really doesn't mean much. It's a small single-digit number. And then there's the economy for everybody else. And the gap between them has gotten so enormous economically that it has lopped over into politics and culture. So in politics, we kind of all know it because the people at the top are smart and they have the money. So they long ago learned it's dangerous if you're a tiny, super rich minority to live in a society that has universal suffrage so that everybody votes. Because everybody, the majority, is not doing real well, and they're going to be looking with a jaundiced eye on the tiny percentage of those at the top who are doing real well. So it behooves those at the top to neutralize that politics, to be able to make the political office holder dependent on their money rather than those majority votes that might otherwise call the tune. And that's what we've got. We've got a political system that is up for bid, and the people at the top have the money to be the outstanding winner in that auction. And I think we've seen that now over and over again. More subtle is the cultural part of this. And the cultural part I would put as follows. For rich people, the name of the game is business, the stock market, and all of that. That's where they play. That's where they take their disposable discretionary income and seek to become very wealthy by buying at one price and selling at a higher price, engaging in all of the business type of transactions. If that part of the economy is doing well, well, then as far as they're concerned, the whole economy is doing well. At the other end, the 90+% of the people who are not significant shareholders, who are not significant business managers, for them, the world looks the way you described it in the travels you've done and the people you've spoken to. For them, the economy is about, do I have $400 for an unexpected expense? Am I going to go nuts trying to get my kid through college on a level of indebtedness I never dreamed I would see in my lifetime? And on and on and on. And we see, for those people, a kind of double tragedy. Not only is the so-called recovery from the crash of 2008 something that bypassed them, but they have to hear all day from the newspapers and the media, who are controlled by the same 1, 2, 3, 4 rich percent at the top, that there is a recovery, that their own experience is the anomaly, and that they could maybe end up feeling really bad about themselves because they blame themselves for missing out on a recovery that everybody else seems to be talking about. And you know, my wife's a psychotherapist, and she says to be left out of something important socially is very bad. But to blame yourself for it takes a bad thing and makes it 100 times worse. And so we're in this bizarre society that sees the world in these diametrically opposed perspectives, but that difference reflects the reality of the underlying economy. And the last point I would make is, in the end, this splitting of one economy into two is more apparent than real, because in the end, the majority will be the determinant. If you keep hammering the purchasing power of the mass of people, eventually they won't be able to sustain the rest of the economy, and then the people at the top will get that bitter lesson that they should have understood over and over again through history. You better be careful how far you push the inequality, because in the end, you risk killing the goose that's been laying your golden eggs. And I think what you're seeing in the stock market over the last 3-4 weeks is the anxiety of the people at the top, the ones who play in the stock market, the ones who write the algorithms of the programs that govern so much of the buying and selling these days. You're seeing them begin to recognize that the jig may be up, that the game may be crashing, and that their wealth in the end is dependent on the impoverishment of the masses, and they've pushed it one step too far.
You know, I see two things, and I'm no economist, but I want to know what you think. On the Republican side, we always hear the panacea is tax cuts, and if we get tax cuts, especially for those, holy job creators, everything trickles down. Obviously, that's bullshit. I'll use that. I mean, already this Trump tax cut, as of July, $430 billion of it went to stock buybacks, not hiring more people. So that's the Republican side. On the left, and Obama used this quite a bit, we got to just retrain people for the jobs of tomorrow. Well, I've spoken with union members who did all that retraining, and there are no jobs, even though they're retrained. So whether it's the right, whether it's the left, they're putting forward, kind of these fairy tales about what will help the masses, when we know what helps the masses, what you were just saying, that mass consumer class, more money needs to go in their pockets. So what is the answer long term? Because Donald Trump, this circus show will be up one day, but if we just put, kind of a kinder Obama 2.0 in office, well, he didn't curb the income inequality. There was changes around the edges. What is the real thing that will lift the majority of those people that don't have enough money to pay for a $400 expense?
Well, in a way, and I'm not playing with you here, in a way, you've answered your question. In the end, you have got to move away from a system that concentrates way too much wealth and way too much income in the hands of way too small a segment of the community, because that is a recipe for the breakdown of whatever social cohesion holds people together in communities. It makes people bitter. It makes people envious. It makes people angry. We know that. We've been there. We've done that. And the reproduction of something so socially destructive is the sign of a society spinning out of control. And for me, the logical inference from all of that is you have to change the society in enough of a basic way that it stops giving a disproportionate share of wealth and income to a disproportionately small portion of the community. I mean, that's not a rocket science insight. That really is the fruit of quite a few centuries of understanding. I teach a course in the history of economic thought, and I start with Aristotle and Plato back in ancient Greece. And I ask the students to read what Plato and Aristotle said. And both of them were very critical, you might enjoy this, of markets. They thought the market, which they had in those days, was an institution that was, here we go, socially destructive. And why? Because the market favors the people who have the money. They're the best able to buy what they want, to invest where it's profitable. They do all of that, which means effectively that the more money you have, the better your shot at making that money grow. That's what the market, that's how it's set up. And for them, that was enough to know this is a bad institution, because they were in favor of mechanisms that equalize the distribution, or at least make it less unequal, as a better way to hold on to the solidarity of the Greek city-states that they were members of. Okay, so for me, the same logic applies. How do we go about fundamentally changing the organization of our economy so it does not produce the kinds of socially destructive inequality we all can see around us? And for me, the answer has evolved over my lifetime of looking at this to the following condensed result. If you made enterprises, the institutions that produce the goods and services we all need and we all depend on, the food, the clothing, the shelter, all of that, if you made those institutions genuinely democratic, that is, all of the people who work in an institution, whether in an enterprise, whether it's a factory or an office or a store, it really doesn't matter. All the people who work there should have equally one person, one vote in making the basic decisions. What they're going to produce, how they're going to produce, where they're going to produce, and here comes the big one, how they're going to divide the rewards of producing and selling whatever it is they make. My view is really kind of simple, that this is a better way to organize enterprise. It seems to me that the decisions should be made on a democratic basis among all the people who work there, together, by the way, with the customers, because the customers have an incentive and have a stake in all of this too. They should be able also to weigh in on what's going on, since they depend on the goods for consumption, just the way the people working in the enterprise depend on the goods in terms of their production. And here's my conclusion. If you made those decisions democratic, there's no way that the people together would vote to give one or two or three of the people in the enterprise a fortune of money while everybody else is anxiety-ridden about their kids' college education or having $400 for an emergency medical bill. Or they're not going to do that. That's craziness, and people aren't self-destructive in quite that way. So it seems to me that would be the way to go forward. And to put it the opposite way, if you allow enterprises to be run by a tiny minority, and let's be real clear, corporate America is run by a tiny minority. 10% of the people own 80% of the shares. Okay, the way a board of directors of any corporation is put together is you get elected by the shareholders on the basis of one share, one vote. So if 10% of the people own 80% of the shares, it's that 10% that selects the board of directors who make all of the decisions. So you have a handful of major shareholders working together with the board of directors they chose, and then you're surprised that those people use their power in the enterprise to give themselves the bulk of the rewards. Why are you surprised? You've set up a system that produces the inequality we mostly agree we don't want. So the solution is change the system. Reorganize production, reorganize the enterprise. I use the simple term worker co-op, not because it's so clear, but because it's something people have an instinctual sense of what it might mean, and that's as far as we can take it at this point. But I would argue you've got to change the way we organize business, or else you're spinning your wheels. You're coming up with one gimmick after another, this law, this regulation. You're not changing the basic game, which is why we keep discovering in America the poverty, the inequality that this generation, like every previous one, is now up against.
Let me ask you about the psychology, because you look at it from both ends. So, to me, we have less of an economy and more of a legalized auction. I mean, money in politics is what we have.
Right.
In the 1950s and 60s, there was more regulation. There was no Citizens United. There was no corporate PACs. There was tighter, stronger labor unions and propping of that. So now what you have is essentially corporations own the politicians, colleges donate to the politicians and could gorge prices, all these things. But in starting with Occupy, and then I would say 2016, we're starting to see more voter education, awareness, and then activism. And you're starting to see the remnants, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez victory, obviously Bernie's movement. To me, everything you're talking about, what we need to do, how do you even start to do anything for those masses of people until we radically change the structure where money is not drowning our politicians? Because our politicians, at the root of it, psychologically, are all about maintaining power, and they view power as how much money can I raise?
Well, I think, again, you've answered your question. And I don't mean to depress anyone, but again, I would have to say that unless I'm going to be joining the mass media, putting you all to sleep, I don't see a solution to this short of basic change. And I don't say that because I'm in love with the concept of a revolution, or that I have some fantasy notion that any of this is easy or straightforward. It isn't. But it's rather that it comes out of this sense. Reforming this system is something we've been trying to do, progressive people have been trying to do, for at least the last century or two, and maybe longer. We have changed the laws, we've changed the tax system, we've created a minimum wage, we did all the regulations you're talking about back in the period after the Second World War and after the Great Depression. And all of those I take to be efforts at reforming the system. And the system found a way either to evade those rules and regulations, or to water them down, or to get rid of them. just as you've summarized. I always like to look at the famous Glass-Steagall law that came out of the great 1930s, when people like today blame the banks for having done a lot of the bad things that produced the Great Depression. And so a law was written by these two Congress people, Glass and Steagall, that broke banks up so that they could not take risky investments with depositors' money. There had to be a wall between the deposits on the one hand and the risky investments banks wanted to undertake, et cetera, et cetera. And the first, literally, before the ink was dry on the law back in 1933, banks were busy figuring out how to get around it. It took them several decades. They did a good job. By that time, they felt that the Depression was a big enough memory in the back of people's minds that they could weaken the law. And then by the 1990s, they felt strong enough. We don't have to evade it. We don't even have to weaken it. Let's just abolish it. And by the end of the 1990s, Bill Clinton, a Democratic president, signs the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. And 8 years later, the banking system collapses. It's like a joke. How don't you understand? What in this simple story is hard to understand? And yet, the effort to re-establish something like Glass-Steagall never really got off the ground under the Obama administration. And ever since Obama, Mr. Trump has clearly eviscerated even the little bit of Dodd-Frank regulation of the banking sector. So it's a wonderful story that illustrates that reform is not the way to go, because we've been there, we've done that, and it was not strong enough to offset or to counteract the underlying structure, which is why I end up, like a lot of people, saying, okay, I might have preferred to be a quiet, gradual reform type of person, but I'm not crazy. You know, the definition of crazy is keeping doing something and imagining it's going to have a different effect in the future than the one it's had over and over and over again in the past. I'm not crazy. I'm confident I'm not crazy. So I've got to move on to the more basic change, because any alternative to that strikes me as either complicity with the inequalities and the failures we have, or else a fantastic, unrealistic commitment to reform simply because you're afraid that the basic change will be difficult. It will be contentious. It will be. But what in the world is the alternative? We now have an economy with a pyramid at the top, showing that it is able not only to concentrate wealth and power, but to give the ultimate political power to a person so obviously out of control, so obviously lost in this system's dysfunction, that it literally frightens the whole world.
And it's interesting bringing up Trump, because to me, I covered the campaign. I was at about 30 to 40 of his rallies. I still need a therapist for all that damage. And to me, I mean, at the root of it, we don't hear this on corporate media, but at the root of it, how does someone like Trump get elected in the first place if you don't have that utter despair? When you look at the exit polls, particularly in those Midwest states, the number one factor was trade and immigration. What Trump was so powerful on, and I'd love to know what you think, was convincing these economically desperate people and frustrated people who had their jobs sold to Mexico and China that it's the Mexicans' fault and the Muslims' fault and the other. So what are your thoughts on, because to me, Trump is a symptom, not the overall disease. What do you think ushered in a Trump, and what kind of longer lasting damage is he doing to an already flawed system?
Okay, I agree with you that Mr. Trump is a symptom, but I don't think he's and I assume you mean this too, he's not the basic problem.
Right.
The basic problem, let's go to those folks in Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and so on, who are generally agreed to have been the swing that made the key differences here. They're right. Their jobs did get outsourced. Their incomes did get savaged. Their social situation is terrible. They're the ones living through the opioid crisis. I mean, there's 100 ways to talk about the agony that those people have been in now. But let's be clear, that agony starts in the 1970s. So it is now almost half a century of decline. They hoped that either this politician or that politician would get them out of it. It failed. They hoped that this reform or that policy or that return to basics or whatever was sold to them, they believed in it for a while. But over those 40 years, say from 1970s, mid-70s to the middle teens of this century, they had to learn, because they're not stupid, that these promises from the leaders they were used to, the Republicans and the Democrats, were not helping, were not solving their problem. So they wanted somebody who was different, so that could have a little bit of belief that maybe this one, precisely because he or she is different, might make a difference. I think many of them voted for a black American, Barack Obama, for president, because looking at him, you knew right away, this is not your regular American politician just because he was black. Okay, it turned out that a black skin doesn't guarantee anything either. Okay, next bet was a weird white guy who talked disrespectfully about all the people you were angry at, Republicans and Democrats alike. Okay, you'll give him, because, you know, you don't have much hope anyway. He's a little different. You were kind of destroyed by the hope and change from Obama that never showed up. Okay, so try Mr. Trump. He is now proving to the mass of Americans exactly what Obama proved, which is lots of smoke, lots of mirrors, lots of theater, lots of drama, no big change. However, for the top 1-5%, Mr. Trump has been fine. They don't like his style. They never did. They don't like his mouth. They never liked that either. But they sure like the tax cut they got last December. And they sure like, and here's perhaps the biggest thing, they sure like that whatever Mr. Trump does, he is extremely careful never to direct popular anger at a target that threatens the top 1%. He never talks that the banks are the big problem. He never talks that the corporate structure is a problem. He never says the word capitalism with a sneer or a critical eye. He's very careful. He's careful to do what they want, to focus their anger everywhere else but on a systemic change, which in my judgment is the only way out of this dilemma. So he represents to me kind of the last gasp. You're going to have to try to explain to those unemployed people, to those people suffering, to a country of 325 million people, that the number of undocumented immigrants, nobody claims it's much more than 10 million, that those 10 million undocumented immigrants who have the worst income and the worst jobs this society has are the cause of the economic troubles of 325 million people. That is so absurd and outlandish and silly that it is a service to the top to even try to sell that story. And Mr. Trump, who's a good salesman, is selling that story. And 30% of our fellow citizens are so upset, so desperate for some solution, that they'll go there because it's still less scary than where, say, Bernie Sanders might want to take the solution, even though he's the mildest socialist one could imagine, and a nice grandfatherly fellow on top of it. But besides all of that, the people at the top are grateful. They got a fantastic tax cut. They made a lot of money. It fueled the stock market boom, at least until the last few weeks. And it deflected mass anger onto foreigners, either the pathetic, poor foreigners trying to run away from bombs and gang warfare in Central America, or those nameless foreigners in Europe that are not reliable allies, in Asia that are somehow eating our lunch in China, etc. Blaming the foreigner is an old tactic, both in the United States and elsewhere. Foreigners don't vote, and you don't know much about them, so you can attribute negativity to them pretty much at will. It is a desperate effort of a desperate politician in a desperate time to hold back the mass recognition of the internal transformation, which is the only hope for a way out. And I think we're in for rough times as that understanding seeps in, as I think it is, to the American consciousness.
And before my next question, I'll point out off of that, I mean, look back to the Soviet Union. They were pointed at as being behind the civil rights movement and propping that up. And we're seeing a lot more of, Russia is behind everything now. I want to ask you, because obviously the 2008 crash, in addition to greed, Glass-Steagall, was a debt bubble exploding. But now you have, I think it's getting a little bit more traction, this modern monetary theory, which says debt isn't as big of a problem as the corporate media and frankly, the Republicans and Democrats talk about. And it's not so much debt we have to worry about because the government can pay for these things. It's just inflation. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's correct. I think the modern monetary theorists took a long, hard, critical look at the conventional money and banking economics that we all teach in American universities and recognized long overdue that a good bit of it, like so much of modern economics, is a pretty thin rationale for the status quo. Basically, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives on both sides, used the government's deficit as an excuse to not do social spending of all kinds, the kind of thing that was done in the Great Depression by the Roosevelt administration under pressure from the mass below, the government employment program, the creation of Social Security, the creation of unemployment compensation. These were mass programs of spending that were paid for by taxes on corporations and the rich in large part. This freaked out the top 5%. They don't want to have to pay taxes to fund programs for the mass of people. That goes back to the way you opened this conversation, and rightly so. So how do you fight that? You can't fight it by saying, we want to hold more money for ourselves and we don't want to spend on you, the majority. That doesn't sound real good. So you have to invent something that sounds reasonable but gets you the result you want. And here we go, the deficit. You tell people, look, just as you would be frightened if you had a big debt hanging over you, so we should all be frightened that the government has a big debt hanging over it, and therefore it is reasonable for us to cut back on that debt, and so we will not be able to fund unemployment compensation the way we once hoped to. There'll be no public employment for unemployed people. We won't be able to do all the things we would have otherwise liked to do for you people. But the real story behind that is we don't want to pay taxes. And the bigger the deficit gets, the bigger the pressure on politicians to deal with it by taxing those who have the money, and this they don't. So it becomes a story. And then radical economists, left-wingers, which the modern monetary theory people basically have always been, left of center. They're not quite Marxists, but they're halfway there. They saw through that. And as they obsessed about it and were angry at the way this deficit is being used, they began to recognize that it's a paper tiger, that there really is no issue there, that the government could pump money into the economy whenever it needed to keep the economy going, that capitalism is so unstable, this is Keynes's insight, that you better have the government standing by, because if not, this system is going to destroy itself. So you have to have the government. The government should do it with money. And so then the only problem becomes you got to be careful how you do that, because if you put too much money in relative to the goods and services, you could get a situation where the people with the money bid up the price, i.e. an inflation, and so that becomes the issue. You don't worry about it until it shows up, and then you develop techniques. This is a way of developing Keynes a bit further, techniques to control the inflation, but the issue of a government deficit drops out because it was never the real issue anyway. My fear, though, is that whatever you did, even if you had modern monetary theory adopted, I'm not naive, and I would urge people who are taken by it not to be naive either. The system gets around the reforms. If you have a reform of government economic management so that you don't focus on the debt and the deficit the way you used to, but you focus instead on pumping money into the system and creating a debt that way and fighting inflation, you haven't found the magic reform, because the underlying inequality, instability, and injustice of capitalism is just as capable of getting around this new reformist mechanism for management as it has shown itself capable of getting around every previous one. Keynes and what existed before Keynes, these are all stories. So for me, yes, it's fine. Let's do MMT. It is seeing through a game, but it isn't getting at the root problem. That still remains, and my hope is that my colleagues in the MMT community will find a way to have common cause with those of us who are for more fundamental structural change and see us as allies in the transformation that has to happen.
I want to ask you, I'm not an economist, but looking at the numbers, that student loan debt looks like the next bubble to me. I mean, it's projected that in 2023, 40% of borrowers are going to be falling behind. I mean, I've met people with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt, and obviously the structure as is, there's no cap. I mean, every year it's going up 5,000 more, 10,000 more. But the psychology, and it's kind of a lose-lose. Well, if you don't go to college, how are you going to get a job? But now if you go to college and drown yourself with debt, how are you going to live? So is this, I don't want to say like the housing crash, but is this similar as far as a bubble that could burst?
Yes, it's similar as a bubble that could burst. You do have to remember that the size of the debt, which is growing very fast and is very important, is still much smaller than the total outstanding debt for mortgages. So to have a bubble in the mortgage is dealing with a many times larger bull in this china shop than with student debt. On the other hand, the student debt is in many ways more socially disruptive. I mean, I'm a professor. I have a student come into my office literally every month, one or two. They're in there to talk to me about a term paper or a final exam or whatever's on their mind. And we talk for 15 minutes. And then, the conversation is done. We do our business. And normally the student would get up and go about his or her business. But they're sitting in their chair, and I'm a reasonably sensitive guy. So it's clear to me they want to talk some more. And so I draw them out. And then the tears come. And by the way, the tears come from the males just as much as from the females. And the tears are always a variation on the following story. I was on the phone last night with my mother, and she was calling to tell me that they're not going to be able to pick up half of my bill for the next semester that's due next week because of whatever's happened at home with Papa's job or with their own financial situations or a younger sibling that needs an operation or whatever. And they're looking at an unbelievable situation. They're carrying more debt than they can cope with. Now they have to decide, do they drop out being stuck with no degree and the debt? Or do they go into even more debt? I mean, these are decisions that you wouldn't want to give your worst enemy. And they begin to talk about what they're going to do through their tears. And it's very quick, becomes clear. These people are giving up on what they love to do and looking for a new major in their curriculum that will get them a job at higher pay sooner. These are people making a decision not to be as productive in their lives as they wanted and could be because this debt is sitting on them. The long-term effects on our economy of having people take jobs they don't want, doing things they don't love, are very, very profound. The number of people that are dropping out because they will not take on more debt, they're terrified of doing it. The loss, incalculable in terms of what we're suffering and will suffer for decades into the future as an entire generation of young people postpone marriage, postpone further education, change where they live, change what they study, what they do, what kind of life they're going to have. These are stupefying economic disruptions of this society being undertaken because the government will not subsidize higher education in the way that most of the countries we're competing with around the world are doing. Let me remind everyone, Germany last year completed the transformation of its higher education system so that there is no cost to go to a university in Germany for anyone. No tuition, no fees, not just for German citizens, for anyone from any country who applies and gets in, and they have many foreign students taking advantage of this. The Chinese are expanding their universities, so are the Indians, etc., etc. This is a society which holds on to its inequality in precisely the way we were talking about, in the end, shoots itself in the foot by this myopic focus on holding on to that level of inequality. And it seems to me that the student debt lunacy is just a wonderful summary example of that kind of social dysfunction.
And real quick, because I know you got to go, but very quick. I think the media is a major problem in this. You're not exactly, getting begged to come on CNN and quoted in the New York Times. We obviously the media is owned by the corporations now, and they're trying to drown out everything from Medicare for all growing in popularity to all the things we've been talking about today. So how do you take this public awareness, because more people are becoming aware, both on the left and the right, and break through some of these structural reforms that need to happen if you have a corporate media suppressing that message?
Well, I guess my answer to you is to tell you a very brief personal story. I've been a critic of capitalism most of my adult life. And for most of that time, people were very wary and nervous when I articulated my criticisms. I could do so as a university professor, but that's mostly because I happen to be a graduate of the very elite universities of this country, which intimidates a lot of people. It shouldn't. Nothing goes on there that's in any way exceptional. But if you have Harvard and Yale after your name, as I do, all kinds of things are possible that are not possible for other people. It should not be. It's not justified, but it is the way it is. So I was tolerated, even though I was critical. In the last 5 years, I have done more public speaking than in the previous 40. I turn down as many invitations to speak now as I accept, and simply because I don't have the time. Physically, I don't have the time. Something is going on, despite corporate ownership of the mass media, to a greater extent than ever, you're quite right. But nonetheless, we had an Occupy movement. We've had a Bernie movement. We had Ocasio-Cortez and all of that kind of thing happening. I would like to believe, and my theory suggests this, that the level of problems of this economy are so deep and so intractable and so durable despite Obama left of center or Trump right of center. Their efforts, their reforms, their little proposals aren't changing anything. You can abusively throw immigrant children literally to their death, as we now see. It's not going to solve anyone's problem. It's only going to make everything worse, which it is doing. And sooner or later, people figure that out. And I think we're seeing that a growing number of them are willing to do extraordinary things. For most of the last half century, any politician who allowed the word socialist to be attached to his or her name was thereby committing political suicide. That's not the case anymore. That's amazing to me. I grew up in an America where I just took that for granted. But I was wrong. That can be changed. It wasn't changed because of the mass media. It was changed despite them. Even they have to now admittedly make capitalism a word that appears in sentences and paragraphs, and not always in a pleasurable way. I notice that even the Bloomberg News Service carries articles that worries that capitalism is coming into significant disrepute. The Gallup poll shows that the majority of young Americans don't think much of capitalism, and while they don't know much about socialism, they're inclined to be favorable because at least it isn't capitalism, and they know what they don't like. So I see my opportunities of speaking mushrooming. I see the audience's reactions. I see the audience's sizes. You know, I have my own radio and television show that goes out to tens of millions of people. I never thought I would be in such a position. I am in such a position. And I get enough ego gratification. You know, I'm no different from the next person. If I was confronted with empty auditoriums and people hissing at me, I probably wouldn't be talking to you now because I don't have a strong enough ego to withstand all of that. But I don't have that. I have the opposite. So I feel very encouraged. I'm not naive. I understand everything you're saying, the opposition, the power of the media. I can see it. But I'm also very taken with the size and rapid growth of a critical tradition that everybody gleefully predicted had long ago died, and turns out to be a ability to resurrect itself, if at this season I can say such a thing, and make itself felt again. And I'm very hopeful because of that.
Thank you so much for taking the time. We got to have you back because, I got to talk about the military-industrial complex and that war economy.
I'd be glad to, and
yeah.
If I could also, do send us a link. We'd be glad to post and promote it as well.
Absolutely. Professor Richard Wolff, definitely check out the YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/democracy@WRK without the O. Thanks again.
Thank you, and I look forward to the next time.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.